Hello, this is Ingvar. So in this video I would like to have a look at the game which was posted on Reddit by a user there, and you can read what he had to say. Basically he wants to, commit to improving in the new year. And yeah, I decided to give some thought to studying a chess opening. Not the typical way to improve if you're 1300-ish. Mainly because I never really make to the end game. So why practice it? Lol. Well, I actually think you should practice the end game. And you say you studied some French defense and you think it helped for this game. So let's have a look at the game. So, our hero in this game has the black pieces. And his opponent opened with a d4 and there was e6. Now he says he wanted to play the French defense, and it's fine to do that against the queen pawn, to play e6. But then if white goes with c4, you have to, of course, choose something else. But I would recommend you either go with something classical, like the queen's gambit declined, with d5, or even go with knight f6, and then you can still go for d5 or the Nimso Indian defense, but I think the queen's gambit declined is probably more solid. So you have to keep that in mind if you play e6. Some people also like to play after c4 to play f5 to play the Dutch, and for that I can recommend Ginger GM DVDs for an example. But your opponent played e4 and then you played d5. So now we transpose to the French defense, which usually starts with pawn to e4 and then e6. And this is the French defense. Now your opponent went e5 here, and here you said, quote, "Here I'm unsure of how to proceed. I know there are moves like c5, f6 and bishop b4, c5, f6 and bishop b4. But I'm unsure of the correct sequence of moves. I decided to thrust with c5. Now this is one of the problems with studying opening theory too early, and especially maybe with videos, is that because you're not actively learning, you're just looking at ideas and you think you're understanding them, and like, oh, I play this and this, but you don't understand them all. Like bishop b4, it's not played after e5. e5, as was played in the game, is the advanced variation. If white goes knight c3, it's a completely different variation. In that case, black sometimes goes bishop b4. Completely different variation of the French, called the Vinegar variation. Has nothing to do with e5. Bishop b4 makes no sense here, because white just plays c3 and we lost the tempo, we must move the bishop back. So c5 was correct. Now your opponent played c3, which is the most common move and a normal move to fortify the pawn on d4. And now you took on d4. And you said, not sure of taking here, but I think it is good because I want to follow up with f6 and attack the pawn chain, which I did with f6. Okay, conceptually your thinking is good. You want to attack the pawn chain most of the time, but here you are doing it too early. c5 and f6 are one of the main ideas in the French to attack the pawn chain, and c5 is played immediately in the advanced variation, but in general black wants to finish development. Knight c6 is a more normal move here. Get the piece out, put more pressure on d4, and then try to get the pieces out. The main problem with taking on d4, as you did, so after c3, c takes d4, is also that after white takes, he gets a very natural square for his bishop on c3, for his knight, where he wants to develop it. And with the pawn on c3, that was previously unavailable, as you can see. So usually black keeps the tension here, he doesn't take on d4. Okay, you follow this up with f6. Now, okay, both sides of course are only moving their pawns, but in general in the opening we should be careful with opening opening lines towards our king, and f6 does that, and you always have to keep that in mind. So my general advice in the French defense about the break with f6 is to err on the side of postponing it a little bit, finishing development, castling, and then playing f6. At least get something out, and always be aware of queen h5. And here this move seems a little bit too early. Your opponent played knight f3, and you play knight c6, which is fine. And now your opponent plays bishop b5. You say after knight c6, I know by playing knight c6 that he will pin my knight, but I'm willing to accept this because it allows me to develop my white squared bishop, which is usually not very good in the French defense. The pin is not a very big deal, and you're right, you just play bishop d7 as you did. Now your opponent castled, so your opponent is actually playing okay. I'm not a big fan of bishop b5, but with f6 it actually makes more sense. We'll get into that later. The thing I want you to learn here about bishop b5, if you want to continue to play the French, is that you always have to be aware of some tactical tricks with knight takes e5. I'll show you one instance where it works. So we'll back up, we'll go to the position where he took on d4, and we'll play the normal move, knight c6. Now let's say white goes bishop b5 here, and you go bishop d7. Now if he plays a normal move like knight to f3, now this tactic that I want you to learn works. Knight takes e5. This is a very important tactic to know in the French. White has two options. If he takes with the knight on e5 now, we regain our piece on b5. The pieces are equal, but we won the pawn that was on e5. So black wins a pawn. The other option is to take on d7, but now the knight that was on c6 just comes back, just takes the bishop, and again we won the pawn on e5. So this tactic wins a pawn for black. Let's go back to the game. After bishop d7 and castles, the question becomes if you can take on e5. And the answer to that is you probably can't. It does get complicated, but the main feature is that this diagonal is always dangerous and you have to look out for it. After knight takes e5, white does have a piece, so we have to win it back. Let's say we take on b5, and there is queen to h5 check. Now there are some complications, but white should be on top, mainly because we can take on g6 with the knight if you go g6, and this also has ideas of entering with the queen here. So always be careful about queen h5. I'll also add that like f takes e5, he can play queen h5 check, and on g6 queen takes e5, and white is hitting this rook. So okay, this tactic doesn't work here, but always keep it in mind. Instead you played f takes e5, and you said not sure if this move was correct, but I did not expect him to take on f6, so took the pawn hoping to leave him with an isolated pawn in the center of the board. Okay, which pawn were you hoping would be isolated? Okay, after f takes e5 he took on c6, and you took with the bishop, which is probably correct. Taking with the pawn is not a huge mistake. But after bishop takes c6, now he has two choices. I think he went for the correct one with knight takes e5. And you mentioned isolated pawn in the center. You don't really have any means to attack this pawn, so white doesn't really have to worry about it. the main factor is that he has a very good square for his knight here, and you also have a weak pawn potentially here on e6. In case if he takes with a pawn takes e5. This is also not isolated, this is easily protected with the rook, with the bishop, with the knight already. But it's true that if you were to take with a pawn, in some cases you can have good development with knight e7, getting it out, maybe bishop c5. But you lacked a little bit in your development because of the early f6. So there were some problems connected with it. So okay, let's see this happen. Bishop takes c6. He played knight takes e5. And now finally development. Very good. White is going to be slightly better. He can take on c6, but it's probably better for now to keep the knight. He played bishop g5. And it seems you're always very worried about pins. And you sometimes should be. But in general, and yeah, from time to time in the French, I'm not too worried. Because bishop for a knight is usually just a good trade for black. You don't really have to worry about that. But nonetheless, you played bishop e7, which is fine. Bishop d6 is also an option, because the pin doesn't really do anything. So I think I would prefer bishop d6 if I had to play this position. Bishop is a little bit more active. Bishop c7, bishop e7 is slightly passiver, but nothing to worry about. Now he played queen c2, and here I think I would probably play rook c8. Like you said, we're not worried about white taking this bishop, which is usually our bad bishop. But he played bishop b5. He went for the tempo, attacking the rook. Rook to c1. And now you're worried about queen to here, which isn't really such a big deal, and you actually could have just castled. And anytime you can castle, you should try to do that. You're right, he can go queen c7, but that's nothing to really worry about. You can protect the pawn in many ways, even bishop a6, and white doesn't really have much, and now you're caught up in development. So I always try to keep development in mind. Bishop d6, covered c7, but also loses time. Now you move this bishop twice, bishop e7 and bishop to d6. You also moved this one a couple of times. You went to d7, you took on c6, you went to b5. And then you've been spending some time on these pawn moves, so we still need to finish development. Knight c3 by white, and now you played rook c8. In general, it looks like a good move, and should be, but in this specific case, white has a tactic. I don't want to spend the time on it. I mean, you can take on f6 with the bishop, and then play queen d1, but it's kind of a computer line that isn't really relevant, but just to be aware of it. And as always, black has to worry about this h5 square once you play f6 and open up the king. So it would help to have been castled here already. Instead, your opponent played queen b3. Okay, bishop to c6, which is fine, and he went knight b5. And here, yeah, you castled, but pawns are also important, so we have to protect this somehow. And bishop to b8 seems like an option to do that, although it's a bit dangerous. Or maybe castles is practically fine, but he does get this pawn here on a7. And here you had some big thoughts about the Greek gift sacrifice, but that wasn't really relevant. But it was nice of you to spot the idea, and it would have arrived in case of something like this. Knight takes c6. In this case, it's more or less just an exchanging operation. You take on h2, and you give a check and take the knight, take the bishop, and you have some counterplay. You're done on pawn, but you have the f file, some threats with the queen, etc. So black should be fine here. But it was like somebody already pointed out, a little bit of hope chess, hoping that white goes wrong. And we should prefer to play good moves and not rely on our opponents too much to do the hard work for us. So now the knight just went back, and you went rook c8. So basically white got the pawn for free. And I think it's a close call, but I think I would take on b5 here, preferring to exchange this bishop like you talked about yourself. Instead he took on d6 now, and now you lost the black squared bishop. And this can be a problem because your black squares are kind of weak. I mean, look at this knight here, this e5 square. You have no way to challenge this square with a pawn. There's no pawn here that can push it, no pawn on d7. So this knight is not easily challenged, and all these squares, black squares, are potentially some weaknesses that you have to worry about. Okay, after queen takes d6, your opponent played rook e1. He actually had an interesting way to get a good position. He could have played bishop takes f6, and this is good because you have to take with the rook. Once you take with the rook, this is a tremendous piece, and you always have to watch out for positions like this, where white gets a dream knight on e5, and you're left with a bad bishop on c6. Quite often these positions are very difficult and often just strategically losing for black, so be careful of that. And I say rook is forced to take because g takes f6 allows a tactic, but okay, it's outside of the scope, but king must go to the corner. What does white do now? Knight f7, discover check, knight g6 works as well, and then we take the queen. But okay, back to the game. Your opponent played rook e1, and you challenged the knight, which was probably a good idea. He went queen g3, and now you took on e5. Queen g7. Now, all of a sudden, it's not too bad. I mean, your opponent is up a pawn, and we still need to get some job for this guy, but you know, overall it's manageable, especially at this level. Played queen g4, you correctly played rook f5 to block this diagonal, and now he played f4, and this is a bad move. This pawn is easily protected. I mean, he can put the queen back on g3. He can even pull the bishop back to e3 and sacrifice the pawn. It's not really bad for white to drop this pawn, because if you can get the bishop here, it's going to be a monster bishop on this diagonal. And playing f4, you also lose the chance to play. It's not a good move right now, but f3 in general. If black were to open up his bishop this diagonal, if white has played f3, it means that this bishop is blunted. It's not threatening anything, it's not attacking anything. So it's very important often to be able to blunt your opponent's bishop. And your opponent, by playing f4, gives your bishop more or less a free hand down on the most important square on this diagonal, g2. And as you saw in the game, it ended up being the decisive factor. You took a chance here. He opened up, the second factor is he opened up his king, and you took advantage of that immediately with queen b6. Well done. King h1, queen takes b2, and now you're not only in the game, you're already better here. He played bishop h6, you played g6. In general, we should try to stay away from making further weaknesses to our king position, and especially here because he has a black squared bishop. Now if he gets the queen around, let's say here and here, it's already very difficult for you. So I would have preferred to protect, perhaps like with my rook, and not weaken my king position further. But g6, okay, it's not a disaster. It's okay, but just to keep in mind, we try not to weaken our king too much. Queen h4, you see that queen e7 is dangerous, and play rook here. He goes back, and you repeat. And you say you're willing to repeat because I didn't see anything better. I thought my position was losing. Yeah, you're misevaluating it, and I think what you missed for a long time is that you should be trying to activate this guy by pushing the d pawn. Okay, let's see what happened. Bishop g5. You go and activate your rook. Rook a8. Okay, fine. You know, a little pawn grab should be okay. Queen to e2. He prevents that. You keep the queens on. I mean, both were okay options, to keep it on or to exchange. And he plays g3, and this should be a red flag. Now you should open up your monster bishop. Maybe even immediately here with d4. Anyway, you play queen c5. You still have a good position. He plays h3. Oh, you played d4 check. Very good. Opening up, and look how powerful this is. You know, any checks you're going to be able to make in the future are going to be devastating. Okay, king g7. I don't understand this move. You should be trying to activate your pieces. Maybe you're thinking about playing h6, but the bishop always has f6, so king g7 just loses time. Free move for white. Now queen d2. He's protecting this, and he wants to play g4. So I understand h5, but you can play rook a3, g4. Actually, you have queen c2, like we talked about. If you can land a jack on the second rank, it's just game over. Okay, that was a bit complicated, so I understand h5 to prevent g4. He plays it anyway, and now you take. And here, okay, the rook doesn't really have any squares, but still you saw that you wanted to play rook h8 jack, but it was protected. So you took an f6, which was nice. And after he takes f6, it's just game over. So a nice finish to the game. Well done. Congrats on the win. Yeah, there were some ideas in the opening there, which hopefully I got across. Especially, yeah, with the pawn breaks that okay, c5 you did was correct, and it's easy to just learn a little bit of theory. Look it up, see where it's still theory. You can do that with plenty of game explorers online. But f6 I would have waited with, and it should have been more of a problem than it was, but I'm sure, and hopefully you learn from this, and f6 will be less of a problem in the future. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little overview. I'll see you in the next one.